Sojourner Truth was born into slavery as Isabella Baumfree in late 18th century New York, at a time when freedom was spoken of as an ideal but denied in daily life. From her first breath, she belonged not to herself, but to a system built on control, silence, and inequality. She grew up without the protection of childhood, without education, and without the right to keep her own family together. Yet from these beginnings emerged one of the most powerful moral voices America has ever known. This is not just the story of a woman who survived injustice. It is the story of a woman who transformed suffering into purpose. Though she could not read or write, her words would one day shake courtrooms, churches, and political movements. Though she was told she was invisible, she forced a nation to see her, and though history often tried to reduce her to a single famous quote, her life was far larger, deeper, and more revolutionary than most people realize. Sojourner Truth's journey takes us from bondage to freedom, from silence to speech, and from the margins of society to the very center of America's moral conscience. Along the way, she challenged slavery, confronted racism, questioned gender inequality, and demanded that justice include everyone not just in theory, but in practice. In this story, you will see how one woman, armed with nothing but faith, courage, and truth, stood against systems far more powerful than herself and changed them. You will hear how her voice carried across decades of struggle, and why her message still matters today in a world that continues to wrestle with equality and human dignity. If stories of forgotten heroes, untold history, and real courage inspire you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these powerful stories alive. Now, let us begin the remarkable journey of Sojourner Truth. The strength that had been forged in Sojourner Truth's early years did not remain hidden for long. What began as quiet endurance slowly became resolve, and resolve, in time, became action. By 1826, Isabella Baumfree understood something essential. Survival alone was not enough. Promises of freedom had been made to her and casually withdrawn, reminding her that obedience offered no protection in a system built on control rather than justice. When the moment came, she chose movement over waiting, uncertainty over submission. Carrying her infant daughter in her arms, she walked away from bondage with no map, no money, and no guarantee that the world beyond the plantation would offer mercy. Her escape was not dramatic in the way history often imagines freedom, but it was courageous in a deeper sense. Each step forward meant risking capture, punishment, or worse, yet she moved with calm determination, guided by the belief that her life, and her child's, belonged to something greater than fear. When she reached the home of abolition-minded Quakers, she found more than shelter. She found people willing to stand beside her, not as owners or saviors, but as witnesses to her humanity. For the first time, the word free began to take on meaning beyond survival. Yet freedom, as Isabella soon learned, was incomplete. So, while she had escaped with her youngest child, her son Peter had been taken from her in direct violation of New York law and sold far away. Many in her position would have been told that such a loss was inevitable, that the system could not be challenged, that grief should be endured quietly. Isabella refused that logic. What followed was a decision so bold that it reshaped her understanding of power itself. She chose to confront the law. In an era when courts rarely recognized the voices of women, and even less so those of formerly enslaved black women, Isabella entered a legal system designed to overlook her. She could not read the documents placed before her. She could not write her own testimony. Yet she understood truth, and she understood injustice, with a clarity sharpened by lived experience. With guidance from allies and unwavering focus, she brought her case before the court, insisting not only that her son had been taken unlawfully, but that her bond as a mother carried moral weight the law could not ignore. The months that followed tested her patience and resolve. She faced delays, doubt, and the quiet disbelief of those unaccustomed to seeing someone like her demand accountability. But she did not retreat. She had already endured separation, violence, and loss. Fear no longer held the same power over her. When the court finally ruled in her favor and ordered Peter's return, it marked more than a personal victory. It was a moment that cracked open the illusion of absolute authority that slavery depended on. That courtroom victory changed Isabella forever. It showed her that systems, even deeply unjust ones, could be challenged when truth was spoken without apology. She had not won through status or education, but through persistence and moral clarity. The woman who walked out of that courtroom was no longer simply a survivor of slavery. She had become someone who understood the force of her own voice. This experience would echo through the rest of her life. It taught her that justice was not granted freely, but demanded, and that silence was never neutral. Long before she would take the name Sojourner Truth, long before crowds gathered to hear her speak, she had already proven something extraordinary. That courage, when paired with conviction, could bend even the most unyielding structures. The path ahead would be longer and harder than she could have imagined, but the direction was now clear. She would not merely walk toward freedom. She would speak it into existence. The victory of reclaiming her son did more than restore what had been taken from Sojourner Truth. It awakened a deeper question that would not let her rest. Legal freedom had given her safety, but it had not given her peace. In the quiet moments that followed, as the urgency of survival faded, a different kind of restlessness began to grow. She had endured suffering, challenged authority, and proven that injustice could be confronted. Yet she sensed that her life had been preserved for a reason that reached beyond her own story. The world around her was changing. In the decades after her escape, upstate New York became a center of religious and moral upheaval, alive with revival meetings, sermons, and public calls for spiritual renewal. People gathered in open fields and crowded halls, searching for meaning in a nation that spoke of freedom while practicing contradiction. Sojourner listened carefully. She did not approach faith as doctrine or performance, but as experience. What moved her was not the polish of preachers, but the idea that truth could be spoken directly, without permission, and that every soul, regardless of status, could be called to act. Her faith did not arrive suddenly or gently. It came as an inner pressure, a sense that silence was no longer acceptable. She prayed, reflected, and wrestled with doubt, not as someone seeking comfort, but as someone seeking clarity. Over time, that clarity took shape as a calling. She believed she had been spared, guided, and strengthened not simply to live freely, but to speak freely. And that speech, she felt, was meant for the road. In 1843, she made a decision that would redefine her life. She left behind the name Isabella Bomfrey, a name given to her by a system that had once claimed ownership over her body and labor. In its place, she chose a name that reflected intention rather than inheritance. She called herself Sojourner Truth. The choice was deliberate and uncompromising. A sojourner was a traveler, someone who did not settle, someone always moving toward purpose. Truth was not an abstract idea to her. It was the substance of her life, earned through pain, endurance, and faith. Taking that name was not an act of reinvention, but of declaration. She was claiming authorship of her own identity in a world that had long denied her that right. With few belongings and no institutional backing, she set out on foot, moving from town to town, guided by conviction rather than comfort. She entered communities as a stranger and left them changed, not because she sought attention, but because her presence demanded reflection. Sojourner Truth did not speak as a scholar or a politician. She spoke as someone who had lived the consequences of injustice. Her words blended spiritual reflection with lived reality, reminding listeners that faith without compassion was hollow and that freedom without equality was incomplete. She spoke in churches, meeting houses, and public gatherings, often facing skepticism or resistance. Yet her calm authority cut through doubt. She did not argue to impress. She testified to awaken. What made her voice so powerful was not volume or performance, but alignment. Her life matched her message. She walked the roads she spoke about, endured the hardships she described, and embodied the principles she demanded others acknowledge. In doing so, she transformed personal faith into public responsibility. By the time her name began to spread beyond local gatherings, Sojourner Truth had already committed herself fully to a life of movement and witness. She had stepped beyond survival, beyond legal victory, and into purpose. The journey she began in 1843 would carry her across states, into movements, and into history, not as someone seeking recognition, but as someone answering a call she believed could not be ignored. By the time Sojourner Truth had embraced her calling and taken to the road, her voice was no longer shaped solely by personal survival or spiritual awakening. It had matured into something broader, something directed outward. Each town she entered added new weight to her mission, and each audience confirmed what she already sensed. Her story carried a force that abstract arguments could not match. She did not speak about injustice as a theory or a distant wrong. She spoke as someone who had lived inside it and emerged with clarity rather than bitterness. As an abolitionist preacher, Sojourner Truth fused faith with testimony in a way that few could replicate. Her speeches were not scripted, nor were they softened to make listeners comfortable. She spoke plainly, drawing on memory and moral conviction rather than formal education. Listeners heard about labor without reward, families divided by force, and the quiet endurance required to survive a system that denied basic dignity. Yet her tone was measured, steady, and resolute, grounded in the belief that truth, when spoken clearly, did not need embellishment. Her presence itself became part of the message. Tall, composed, and dignified, she stood before crowds that often expected something else entirely. What they encountered instead was authority born of experience. She challenged religious audiences to consider whether faith could exist alongside injustice, and she asked reformers to look beyond slogans toward lived reality. In doing so, she carved out a space where morality and action could no longer be separated. In 1850, recognizing that spoken words alone could not carry her story everywhere it needed to go, Sojourner Truth took another decisive step. She dictated her life story to a trusted ally, resulting in the publication of the narrative of Sojourner Truth. The book was simple in language but profound in impact. It traced her journey from bondage to freedom, from silence to speech, without dramatization or self-praise. For many readers, it was the first time they encountered the reality of slavery through the voice of a woman who had endured it and refused to be defined by it. The narrative did more than inform. It legitimized her presence in reform spaces that often valued printed words over spoken ones. It allowed her voice to travel beyond the limits of geography and physical strength, reaching homes, churches, and meeting halls she might never visit. At the same time, it provided her with modest financial support, allowing her to continue traveling independently rather than relying on organizations that might seek to shape her message. Sojourner Truth also understood something that few activists of her era fully grasped: the power of image. At a time when photography was becoming more accessible, she chose to use it deliberately. She commissioned portraits of herself, posed not as a spectacle but as a composed, self-possessed woman, often shown seated, knitting, or dressed simply. She presented herself with dignity and calm strength. Beneath these images, she included a line that captured her insight. She sold the image so the substance could endure. These photographs circulated widely, carried by supporters and sold at gatherings, turning her likeness into a symbol of resilience and moral authority. In a society that often erased or distorted the identities of black women, Sojourner Truth asserted control over how she was seen. She transformed visibility into a tool for independence, using it to fund her work and protect her autonomy. Through preaching, writing, and imagery, Sojourner Truth built a form of activism that was both deeply personal and strategically forward-looking. She did not separate belief from action or storytelling from survival. Each element reinforced the other, creating a message that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. By the time her name was widely recognized in abolitionist circles, she had already established something rare, a voice that carried authority without hierarchy and influence without compromise. By 1851, Sojourner Truth had already spent years refining her voice in churches, meeting halls, and public squares, learning how different audiences listened and where their convictions quietly fractured. When she rose to speak at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, she carried with her not only faith and experience, but a sharp awareness of who was usually absent from conversations about equality. The room was filled with debates about womanhood, rights, and moral worth, yet much of that language assumed a narrow image of who a woman was meant to be. Sojourner Truth stepped into that space knowing she did not fit the picture many held in their minds, and that was precisely the point. Her speech, later remembered as "Ain't I a Woman?", did not unfold as a polished argument, but as a direct confrontation with contradiction. She listened as speakers described women as delicate, protected, and in need of special consideration, and she measured those words against her own life. Without anger or performance, she asked a question that cut through abstraction. If womanhood was defined by care, vulnerability, and moral value, why had those protections never applied to her or to women like her? The question lingered not as a demand for sympathy, but as an exposure of exclusion. Sojourner Truth spoke of work, endurance, and loss, not to seek validation, but to challenge the logic that separated strength from womanhood. She described a body that labored as hard as any man's, a life that carried responsibility without recognition, and a spirit that remained intact despite constant denial. In doing so, she dismantled the idea that femininity and capability were opposites. Her words suggested that strength did not erase womanhood, and that suffering endured without choice did not diminish dignity. What made the moment so powerful was its simplicity. She did not rely on theory or rhetoric borrowed from others. She relied on lived truth, spoken plainly. So here, grounded in memory, in a movement where the experiences of black women were often sidelined or treated as secondary, she placed herself unmistakably at the center of the question. Equality, she implied, could not be genuine if it rested on definitions that excluded those who bore the heaviest burdens. The speech also revealed the limits of reform movements that failed to examine their own assumptions. By addressing racism and sexism together, Sojourner Truth exposed how easily one form of injustice could be challenged while another remained untouched. She did not accuse her listeners directly, yet her presence made evasion impossible. If rights were universal, then universality had to be tested against the most marginalized lives, not the most comfortable ones. This moment fits seamlessly into the path she had already forged. Her faith taught her that truth was not meant to be hidden or softened, and her years of testimony had shown her that silence only preserved inequality. The speech became another extension of her mission, to speak where voices were missing, and to insist that moral arguments be measured against reality. It echoed the same clarity found in her narrative and the same dignity captured in her photographs. Each medium carried the same message, shaped differently but rooted in one conviction. In the years that followed, the speech took on a life of its own, retold, reshaped, and remembered as a turning point. Yet its enduring power lay not in any single phrase, but in the way it forced a reckoning. It asked audiences then, and continues to ask audiences now, to consider who is included when rights are named, and who is quietly left out. Through that question, Sojourner Truth did more than claim space for herself. She widened the meaning of womanhood itself, anchoring it not in comfort or privilege, but in humanity shared across difference. As the nation was torn apart by the Civil War and struggled to redefine itself afterward, Sojourner Truth did not retreat into symbolism or memory. She remained actively engaged with the unfinished work of justice, turning her attention to the lives of black soldiers, newly freed people, and women who found that freedom on paper did not always translate into dignity in daily life. While armies marched and laws changed, she traveled, spoke, and confronted leaders, insisting that liberation without protection, opportunity, and equality was not enough. She advocated for black men who had fought for a country that still questioned their worth, pressing the government to recognize their service and humanity. At the same time, she spoke for freed families navigating poverty, displacement, and broken promises, urging policies that offered land, work, and stability rather than abandonment. Her belief in land reform came from a simple truth she understood deeply. Freedom could not survive without a place to stand, to work, and to build a future. Long before such ideas were widely accepted, she also challenged segregation, refusing to accept separation as a natural order and treating inclusion as a moral obligation. Women's rights remained central to her vision, not as a single-issue cause, but as part of a broader demand for full human recognition. She continued to speak in spaces where women were still questioned as political actors, and where black women were often rendered invisible even within reform movements. Her voice carried the same clarity it always had, grounded not in ideology, but in lived experience, faith, and an unshakable sense of justice. Sojourner Truth lived long enough to see parts of the world change, but not long enough to see all her hopes fulfilled. Yet her impact did not fade with her passing. Over time, her life and work became woven into the nation's historical conscience. Laws, memorials, schools, and public spaces now bear her name. Her image and words are preserved not as relics, but as reminders of courage that refused to wait for permission. National recognition has finally placed her among the figures who shaped America's moral direction, even when the country itself resisted that truth. Her legacy endures because it speaks to more than a single era. It asks enduring questions about who is heard, who is protected, and who is included when progress is declared. Sojourner Truth did not simply challenge injustice. She challenged complacency. She forced society to confront the gap between its ideals and its actions, and she did so with unwavering honesty. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and to reflect on the life of a woman whose courage still resonates today. If you found this journey meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these important stories alive and ensures that voices like Sojourner Truth's continue to be heard.